Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Homeschooling Global Summit 2020. We are honored to introduce to you Judy Sarden, strategic education strategist, author, and speaker. Judy Sarden is the author of Sarden's Practical Guide, How to Start Homeschooling. She hosts the How to Homeschool podcast and speaks nationally on home education and general education topics. A corporate attorney for over 20 years, Judy has homeschooled her 2 children for 8 years and brings her corporate and legal strategy skills to families by helping them to strategically plan their children's academic and extracurricular career to position them for college admission success and beyond. Judy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys.
Awesome. Okay, so today we will hear your thoughts on why Black children should be homeschooled. But first, can you please tell us your story? What led you to homeschool your own children?
Sure. So I've been homeschooling for 8 years now, and we started when my son was starting kindergarten. Before that, both of my children were in a Montessori school, and it was going really well. And then he was assigned a teacher who was just coming out of the New York public schools. And the whole Montessori environment changed, and it was more like a school setting. And what I observed was that after being, a good student before that, now all of a sudden, every day I would go and pick him up, there would be a report about something he had done. And it would be just something ridiculous, like, oh, he's 4 years old and he was playing on the 5-year-old playground. It would just be ridiculous stuff. Every single day I picked him up. And so he was an early reader. He began to regress. He began to hate school. He began to think that he was less than because he had brown skin. I was reading a book. I'll never forget this. I was reading a book about Berenstain Bear's book, and it was about you can be whatever you want to be. And when I got to the page that talked about being a doctor, I said to him, "Hey, would you like to be a doctor?" And he says, "No." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because brown people can't be doctors." And I was floored, because at that time, we had never even mentioned race in our house. My husband's biracial, and race, we kind of took the approach, well, we won't talk about race, and so it won't be an issue. But it had become an issue right under our nose, and we didn't even know it, because it was at school where it had become an issue, and he had already begun to internalize that as a brown person, there were things he couldn't do. So between the regression that year, he became very disengaged. He became very angry, and we had no idea why. We spoke to the teacher numerous times, talked to the administrator numerous times. We could never get a response or anything. So it just became very clear. Then they start talking about ADHD. My son is not ADHD. And they start talking about medication for him to go forward. And I was just, no, we're not going down this road with my brown son, with my Black son. So that's, I looked at different alternatives. I looked at private school, because clearly the public schools are out. He was in private school then. Public schools are out. Other private schools, we're going to have more of the same. Research told me that we were going to have more of the same. My own experience told me we'd have more of the same. And it just kind of boiled down to, I never ever thought about homeschooling, ever. I was a corporate attorney moving up the corporate ladder. But it just came down to, it was either my son, which one do I give up? Do I give up my son, or do I give up my career? So it was a no-brainer. So I didn't give my career up, I simply changed it. So it's just doable, but yeah, that's why I started homeschooling.
Okay, well, you sacrificed and you made a decision based on what was most important to you at the time. So there are, for you, there were reasons why you wanted to take your son out of traditional schooling. And I know that there are many different reasons why families choose homeschooling. Some look at the benefits of the freedom and being able to make their own choices and schedule. And others are like you, trying to escape what they see as a negative environment for their child. Now, Judy, would you share some of the main reasons why you believe parents should consider homeschooling their Black children?
Sure. So, the reasons are myriad, but I'll give you kind of the top 5. So the first thing is inherent bias in the schools create lower expectations. And it's inherent bias. And when I talk about inherent bias, I'm not talking about even inherent bias. It's a racial thing. It's just systemic. Research shows that Black teachers, as well as white teachers, so it's not a racial thing, have this inherent bias against Black children. So, for example, in my son's case, he was an early reader, and he was actually one of those students that the school would bring potential parents around to see their work, because he was actually one of those kids who was he's always been very bright. The teacher, who was Black actually, who came into the Montessori setting, refused to, she wouldn't push him. She wouldn't help him continue on, because in her mind, I don't know what it was in her mind, but the expectation, I guess from where she came, little Black boys didn't read, I don't know, but there was no expectation that my son would be at the level where he was. And therefore she wouldn't meet him where he was and wouldn't help him to progress. And so I sent numerous books and other things, letters to her to try to get her to understand where my son was and to please continue to push him on. She just wouldn't do it. And so it was kind of that inherent bias based on where she had come from, based on her experience, whatever, that just wouldn't push him on. And so that's one of the things that happens with Black children. It's you read all the statistics about Black kids, the divide, the academic divide, where Black kids score so low, white kids score so high. And I think that's kind of one of the things that people kind of inherently expect Black children to be less than. And so whether it's an overt or covert expectation, whether it's deeply held or whether it's on the surface, it's just systemic. And so when you have those lower expectations, what kid is going to kind of rise above? It's hard. They're little kids. And so if that's the expectation, a lot of kids will meet that expectation. And so that actually holds Black kids back. So that's one of the reasons, just the inherent bias that creates the low expectations and can end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy in the system. Reason number 2, schools have outsourced discipline. This is part of the whole school to prison pipeline that you may hear people talk about. When I was growing up, if you misbehaved in school, they'd call your mom, go to the principal's office, you might have a 3-day suspension. But now things that used to be taken care of by the school are now immediately outsourced to the resource officer, also known as the police officer, that's physically present at the school at all times. So when, a simple fight used to be, separate the kids, they both have detention. Now these kids are put in the police car and taken down to the police station. They're arrested. Their little hands are put in zip ties. And research shows that the earlier kids have those true run-ins with law enforcement, the higher percentage of the higher chance they have of actually becoming part of the prison system. And so when they're arresting kindergartners, I mean, you can Google it, when they're arresting kindergartners and first graders and second graders for minor things that should be handled at the school administration level, that's starting that school to prison pipeline. So that's another thing, they're outsourcing now school discipline to police officers. I'm not even going to call it a resource officer, to police officers. And police officers are doing what they do as police officers. They're treating young children as criminals. And those things, again, become another self-fulfilling prophecy. The third reason is excessive discipline. And it kind of comes in similar to the outsourcing of discipline. But the excessive discipline is when you have white kid who does something, you have black kid who does something. White kid gets detention, black kid gets suspended, or even an attempt or success at being expelled. So, it's again, more research is out there to show that Black children consistently receive far more disciplinary, far harsher disciplinary action than their white counterparts for doing the same things. It's kind of like one of those, to see the kids hanging out in the park after dark. The police might pick up the white kid and take him home, whereas they might pick up the black kid, take him down to the station. Now his parents got to come pick him up at the police station. And so it's the same sort of thing where, people point to the statistics, well, Black children are suspended 3 times more than white kids. But if you look at the discipline records, you'll see Black kids doing the same thing that the white kids are doing. The white kids are just simply not getting expelled for it or suspended for it. So it's the excessive discipline that Black children receive, and Black girls actually receive harsher discipline than anybody for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that a lot of people think is that putting their Black children in private schools is going to save them. If I'm paying $25,000 a year for private school, then certainly my kids are not going to have these same issues. But it's the same issue. It doesn't change. It's systemic. So the fourth reason why Black children should be homeschooled is because you can teach Black history at home. I was doing a speech down in Texas. I was doing a convention down in Texas, and I'll never forget this young woman's story because it's true. She had grown up in all-white schools. She's a Black lady. She grew up in all-white schools, and she told the story of how every year for Black History Month, she hated Black History Month. She said she loved school. She loved her school. She always had really good friends. She really had a good school experience until February when they hit Black History Month. And the reason why Black History Month was horrible is because all year, we've learned about Alexander the Great. We've learned about the great Roman civilization. We've learned about the so smart and cerebral Greeks and the architecture that everybody's still using today. We learned about all this fabulous stuff with European history. And then we take 1 month to learn about Black people were slaves, and Black people had fire hoses trained on them, and Black people this and Black people that, and Martin Luther King, who's of course trotted out every February, and Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks. Where's the uplifting history for Black people? And so she said that she would sit there and literally cringe. She said she would be so embarrassed all month. Every time they, brought out the typical Black history trope, she would just cringe. She would feel like crying. The Black History Month was very traumatic for her. And she said she would feel like her classmates were looking at her in a different light. And she personally felt that every year, starting in February, her friends treated her differently. And so, this is one of those things, how a lot of this bias and this stuff, the history, the only history that they teach about Black people is, we were enslaved and we've been fighting our whole life, right? And so that not only affects us when we're sitting there listening to it, but it affects the kids around us too. And so one of the things that you can do if you're homeschooling your own child, your African-American child, your Black child, is you can teach them their whole history. And that's what I do with my own kids. Every school here starts with enslavement of Black people in North America. No other people's story starts once they arrive in North America. Only Black people, right? And so, you know, my husband is part Scottish. We have all kinds of Scottish history. We've got, we learn about the French. We learn about all the other European peoples before they arrived. It's called world history. We learn about all that stuff. And then when we learn about, when they come over here, we learn about how, you know, they had the revolution and they fought for their freedom and all that stuff. But we don't talk about Black history until Black people arrived here. We don't talk about the 5,000 years of African history. We don't talk about, you know, the only thing we talk about are the Egyptians, and a lot of times it's presented in a way that makes Egypt seem separate from Africa. And so if you're homeschooling your brown children, you can talk about the great Mali Empire. You can talk about Mansa Musa. You can talk about how he was the richest man in the world because he actually he controlled the Gambia River. And you can talk about you can talk about the Ethiopian Empire that's never been conquered by Europeans and the reasons why. And so then you can talk about so many other peoples within the African continent, which is a continent, it's not a country. You can talk about all these things that happened in African history so that you can talk about how people were enslaved, both within Africa. You can talk about how people were enslaved all over the world. There's been enslavement of people, of every people throughout history. You can talk about the economics. You can talk about the war. You can talk about the reasons why people were enslaved. You can talk about what different enslavement looked like throughout history so that by the time you make it over here to the United States, the enslavement of Africans here is part of their history, and they can look at it as the political and economic machine that drove it, and it has a context. And it's no, you know, white kids or Black kids are now no longer thinking that Black people are the only people enslaved in the world in history, because we weren't. Black kids can see that this was 400 years of our history and not our entire history. And when you can teach kids that about themselves, it really elevates the way they feel about themselves, and they can look at the world very differently. So I am a huge proponent of teaching African history as part of world history, before teaching kids Black history here in the United States. And so the fifth reason is that, you know, we know schools are not serving Black kids. And so if the schools are not going to serve your children, if they've proven time and time again that they are not the best place for our children, then why would we send them there? You know, would we send our kids anywhere else that we knew was bad for them? No, we wouldn't. Would we send them anywhere else where we know that their self-esteem is going to be impacted so much with the microaggressions that they have to deal with every day and all day, that they just suck up? You know, when I was growing up, I was part of the first wave of kids that went through the desegregation in Birmingham. And so, you know, most people were familiar with, at least Americans are familiar with what went on in Birmingham. That's the place where they were doing the civil rights movement. The fire hoses were blasted on the children who were doing protesting, the peaceful protesting, where they unleashed the dogs on the children who were doing the peaceful protesting. And so I was part of the first wave of kids that was bused. I was literally put on a public bus and bused across town, because I was one of the smart kids at the Black neighborhood who the teachers thought should go to the alternative schools, the school for gifted kids across town. So I got on the bus. My mom put me on a public transportation bus, and to the other side of town I went. And, you know, I didn't realize it until much, much later. You know, the stuff that the kids used to say to me, it got inside of me. You know, I was told, and I believed for a really long time, same as my son, that my skin was ugly, that I was ugly, my hair was ugly, I was dumb. You know, the kids would say stuff every day. And after a while, I internalized it. And it's basically took me 40 years of my life to finally shed it. But, it's traumatic for children to be in those kinds of environments. And, I remember once my mother had gotten my hair braided and I had beads during the 70s. It was very fashionable during the 70s. And I felt like I looked so good. And I was sent to the principal and told by the principal that I could no longer wear my hair that way. And I felt so good about myself because in my neighborhood, that was a big deal. But after that man, he's a big guy too. He's like 6'4", so he's really, really big to a second grader. After that, being sent to the office and told that my hair was bad, I never, ever wanted my hair like that again. Of course, my mother refused to take it down. She went up to the principal's office and told him what she thought about what he'd said, but it was too late. The damage had been done to her little brown child. So, those are the sorts of things that your children, those kind of microaggressions, that was something that I thought about telling my mother, but I never told her, so-and-so called me ugly today. So-and-so told me my skin was ugly, or all the little things that, no one wanted me on their team, and just the little stuff that kids do. Those things, I never took them home, but I took it inside my little soul every day. So, that's, so I believe that when you know that your child is going to be going into an environment that's not good for them, you figure out a way to put them in an environment that's loving, that's supportive, because at the end of the day, yes, the children will have to deal with racism. I mean, look at America right now. I cannot shield my children from racism. They deal with it even at their young ages, but at least I can, while they're at home, I can build them up. I can build their self-esteem by letting them know their history. I can let them know themselves, and I can be right there with them when some of this stuff happens, and we can deal with it right there. We can have a discussion right then and there. And so those are all the benefits. It was a little long-winded, but those are really, in a nutshell, the many reasons why I think that Black children should be homeschooled.
Yeah, I would be right there with you if I was having the same kind of experiences with my son. And I'm wondering, it's definitely, it seems like a positive to bring your son home, but what are some of the challenges that families face when they are homeschooling Black children with regards to societal pressure, family pressure, or even a white parent with a Black child? What kind of issues are they facing? You've talked to a lot of different families about this issue.
Yes, so I talked to a lot of families who have adopted white families who have adopted Black children, and one of probably the most common question that they ask me is, should I put my kid in public school so they can be around other Black kids? And I say, no. But, these parents are concerned because they've been told by people that the children need to be around other Black people, Black kids. And what I always tell people is this, and this is specifically to a parent of a bright biracial child, or parents who have white parents who have adopted Black children. You are your child's number one best ally. You are the child, you are the parent, you are the one who's going to love that child. And I think at the end of the day, the first thing children need is to know that they have that love from their parents. That's the first thing. Second thing is, your family has your set of values. And so the second thing you should do is surround yourself with people who share your same values. And so I would recommend that those parents try to find situations, whether it's a church or whether it's, if you like to boat a lot, or, go to the places where things you like to do, the things that support your family's values. And if you see a family of color, introduce yourselves. But that's kind of the second thing, love your child. And then the second thing that's most important is to raise your child with the values that you hold. If you can find brown people in those settings, even better, because they're probably out there. You just have to look, because Black people are into everything now. Things that used to Black people ski now. So it's like things that Black people maybe you didn't find them doing before, you can find them doing now. You just have to look. And then the third thing is, so you've got your love, you've got your values, and then look for opportunities. Simply look for opportunities to get your children involved. Honestly, I live in an area that's predominantly white. And I mean, my daughter just did musical theater camp. She was the only Black kid there. My son does travel baseball. He's usually the only Black kid, or maybe there's one other on his team. But I found that they both have friends. They're able to find friends, and I've actually been frankly surprised at some of the allies that we actually have. I didn't know we had during this tumultuous time. So sports is usually a good way to find other Black kids. I mean, it is. Another way is to simply look. Because of where we live, I have found a Black homeschooling group. And so we do things with them, just like we do with our other groups. But at least we know, that they do have that opportunity to be around other Black people. But really, the funny thing is, with the Black homeschooling group, we have in common that we are Black. We're all different religions. We have different parental philosophies. And so, again, that's one of my groups, but it's not my only group, because most of the people that we are around are people who share our values. And whatever they look like, they look like. And so that's really, that's what I would say to people who the parents who are not Black, to just look for opportunities, but definitely just sticking your kid in a public school is not the option. You have to be intentional. I have to be intentional. I homeschool. I have to be intentional about getting my kids out of the house and being around other kids. And you just have to be intentional, but definitely school is not the knee-jerk reaction. So on to what are the challenges for, say, an African-American family? In my case, like I said, I was kind of the first wave of kids being bused after the civil rights movement. My mom marched with King, and I'm the first generation of people, literally the first generation of Black people, who could get a job wherever I wanted, I could go whatever school I wanted, and I can live wherever I want. I am the first generation. You're looking at the first generation of Black people who could do that in the United States. So when I'm talking about leaving my corporate job, my good job, that my mom fought for, that lots of people fought and died for, when you talk about leaving that to just stay at home and raise your kids, even though I continue to work, even if you talk to my mother today, she thinks I don't, because I'm not going someplace to work because I'm doing it at home. It's very frustrating. But anyway, people, it's like a slap in the face. My father asked me, just based on history, he asked me, well, if you quit your job, forget about the fact that, Daddy, I'm still going to be working. But if you quit your job, what's going to happen when your husband leaves you? I'm like, my husband's not going to leave me. We've got a great relationship. Relax. And so you have a lot of these things that are just inherently cultural that you're fighting. So I had no support from my dad at all, although he did agree that my child being outside of the school would be far better from him being in the schools, because my dad grew up in Mississippi, rural Mississippi, in the 40s and 50s. His schooling was pretty much non-existent. And when they moved up north, he and his brothers were put back 4 grades because they had pretty much a non-existent education while they were living in Mississippi, because Black people really didn't get an education. And so he agrees wholeheartedly that between the school and me schooling him at home, the superior education is going to be at home. But he just couldn't, like my mother, couldn't wrap his head around the fact that I can work from home, I can still earn money. And so that's a big thing. The other thing is, as a Black mom, Black women have traditionally had to work. And working, is changing now, particularly with the COVID thing. But before that, working meant leaving the house, leaving your children with someone and leaving the house to do it. And so just because from a cultural standpoint, a lot of Black women end up being the primary supporter for the home because she's single, you know, it was just huge. You know, how could you leave your job? And so I think that we as Black people just have cultural issues that hold us back. And then the last thing I would say is, you know, as Black people in America, we have had to toe the line. We have to stay in line with what the government tells us to do, or else we get murdered. We get, you know, talk about the people during the civil rights that were murdered because they were accused by a white person of stepping out of line, looking at a white woman, whatever, which is against the social mores. We're very much in a culture of depending on the government to take care of us. It's kind of permeates some parts of Black culture. And so since the government's going to take care of us, I think sometimes we feel we can't take our kids out of the government school, because if we do what the government tells us to do, we'll be taken care of. And so I think that sometimes some of that plays into why people are it's very hard for people to go against that thing that's kept us relatively safe. I mean, it hasn't kept us safe, obviously, but if we ever stepped outside of the government's purview, then we definitely weren't protected. And, you know, I've lots of stories of Black moms who pulled their kids out of school and had their neighbors call child services on them because their neighbor didn't think it was right that she should be taking her kids out of school. And so I've heard a lot of that. Now that happens to white people too. White people talking about it too. So it's not endemic in the Black community, but a lot of it is, at least, you know, it's not necessarily a neglect thing. It's just kids are supposed to be in the school. And so if they're not in the school, something's wrong. And so I think that that's another kind of thing that holds us back. And then, of course, yes, you have to be intentional. You have to be intentional about finding playmates for your kids. You have to be intentional about finding places for your kids to go where they're around people who look like them. We have Black doctor, Black dentist, Black orthodontist. I have to drive to get these people, but it's worth it. You know, and I've intentionally look for people. I intentionally look for Black women and Black men in these roles, and, you know, these kind of service provider roles, so that my children can now, you know, they see where they see Black people in all different venues. I mean, the fact that mom's a lawyer meant nothing. The fact that dad's an architect meant nothing. They have to see people outside of us. So yeah, so that those are some of the challenges, I think, to homeschooling your African American children, for everybody.
Yes. So I do something similar with my own choice of doctors. I look for the African name, or I ask around, and oh, she's from Jamaica. Awesome. So I look for somebody that isn't from around here. Really, that's what it is. I want someone who's got a bigger view of the world, and often people from other countries are going to have that bigger view of what is right and wrong in terms of health.
Yes, yeah. I can tell you what my Indian doctor told me about COVID, but I won't, because I'd probably outrage a lot of people.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic. So I know you're not an expert on every part of the world, and we seek out experts in different areas, but since families are tuning in from all over the globe for the Homeschooling Global Summit, would you say that many of the reasons that you've explained why homeschooling would be good for Black children, could that apply to children from many other marginalized groups in other parts of the world and in the United States?
Absolutely. I've spoken to, at some of the homeschool conventions where I've talked to people, I've talked to Iranian, just off the top of my head, an Iranian mom. I've talked to a few Asian moms, and Hispanic moms. And so, yeah, they, and particularly in the United States, they express many of the same things. It's kind of the way that a mom phrased it to me actually last week. Her child is half Native American, but she says that he's just brown enough to trip the wire. And so, to be on the other side. And so yes, particularly in America, it's going to be very similar issues. It's particularly strong towards Black people simply because of the history that this country has. But certainly if you're in this country and you trip the wire, the very same things can occur. So as far as globally, I would say that a lot of anywhere in the world, I've visited countries in Europe, and unfortunately, due to colonialism, a lot of this shades of brown thing is present pretty much everywhere. And so you've got that pretty much everywhere. But I think that the biggest thing, I had my reasons for beginning homeschooling, but what I love about homeschooling is that we can travel anytime, anywhere. I love the freedom, and I also love the freedom. So I like being able to teach my kids what I want them to learn. So when I talked about history, I can teach them the history that they need to learn. And so when they talk about math, I don't have to wait for some authority to tell me that my son is ready for Algebra 1. I can just put him in it and we're doing it. And so I love the freedom of being able to teach my child whatever they need to learn. My daughter is a fabulous artist. And so I'm going to be gearing her education towards a career where she can use her artistic talents. And so she's not going to have to take calculus, because guess what? I don't think she'll ever need it. So why bother? So I like the fact that I can cater my children's education to their interests, and they don't have to bog themselves down just doing the status quo because that's what some school administrator decided every single person needs to do, even though every single person is not going to be on a college track. Every single person is not, there's trade schools, they're starting a business. There's so many other options now that people have. And so I like the fact that I can, and this is what I help other people do, figure out what it is that child needs, where that child's going to go, and then cater their education towards that. And so anybody can benefit from that. I mean, that's honestly, I think it's the wave of the future. And so by homeschooling now, you can get your child can kind of get the jump on it before the rest of the world kind of gets on board, because it's clearly the wave of the future. So I like the freedom of being able to cater an education around my child, and I like the freedom of being able to travel whenever I want. I don't have to plan my whole world around the school calendar. And, that's awesome. So being able to just move around, being able to travel, I have a friend who was set to be in Europe for 3 months with her children. And until, the border shut down, she had to come back. But, so I love the freedom of just being able to have your child explore the world, because as you mentioned, in the United States, we tend to be so insular. And I like the idea of exposing my children to different countries, to different worlds, to a different way of thinking. And I feel like homeschooling, there's no other, when you compare homeschooling to brick and mortar school, there's no comparison when it talks to truly raising a child who really thinks globally. I don't want my kids to think Atlanta, Georgia. Oh my gosh, I would feel like a failure if my kids are just Atlanta, Georgia thinking. I'm raising my children to be global thinkers. And so that's, I think, why homeschooling is great for anybody who is kind of that mindset.
Definitely. We can agree on that for sure. When you were talking about the reasons for homeschooling Black children, what came up for me was that it doesn't seem like a very good environment for any child to be in, where a group or groups of brown children are being treated differently, being given harsher punishments, seen as less than or not as capable. And yeah, I think that a parent of a child of any hue and background could benefit from homeschooling and being able to expose them to, like you said, a wider view, take them to places that are outside of their normal, few miles that they travel most days. Take them to another country if you can. Take them to a next state, across the border, wherever you are. It will widen your view. People may be shocked to see how many Africans there are in France. There are so many people in places you wouldn't guess the influences there. And I am so happy to have been able to talk to you today. I am sure that parents around the world are going to be taking your thoughts to heart and considering the future for their children. And before we go, I just want to hear a little bit more about your strategic homeschooling planning services, because who knows, there might be parents out there that need help like that. And I'd love for them to know what you offer and where they can go to find that information.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's called Strategic Education Planning, and you can find me at judysarden.com. It's very easy. On Instagram at Judy Sarden Speaker, and also Facebook at Judy Sarden Speaker as well. And one of the things that I do is I help, just like I was mentioning earlier, I help families kind of identify what it is your child wants to do. And I hear so many people saying, I have no idea what my kid wants to do. My kid has no idea. But there are ways that we can start working with your child. I like to start working with kids 7th, 8th, 9th grade, which may in other countries, that's probably ages 12, 13, 14. And so to help them begin to really formulate where it is they want to go, because it's really important to know what that end game is. And so I work with families to help them identify that end game and then work backwards from there so that we're planning, so that we are positioning the child so that they can reach that end game and be successful and be able to achieve that end game. That's essentially what it is. So for a lot of families, that it means academic planning as well as outside activities. Because I'm talking, start a business, do an internship with somebody. Maybe you know someone who your child can shadow. So for some families, I do the academic, help them schedule the academic as well as the outside activities. But then some families are happy with their school environment, but they still need, if you're trying to apply to college, you got to have something more than just, I volunteered at the retirement home for 40 hours. And so for those families who want their kids to stay in school, I can still help them to plan their outside activities so that they've got that story to write, when they're writing their college applications, and not just, I was well-rounded. You've got to be more than well-rounded now. You've really got to be outstanding if you're wanting to get in some of the top schools. So I do both of those. So you can reach me, like I said, at www.judysarden.com or at Judy Sarden Speaker on Facebook and Instagram.
Okay, great. I hope some people look into what you have to offer. It sounds like it would be very useful to new homeschoolers, especially. So thank you so much, Judy, for joining us for the Homeschooling Global Summit.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed talking to you.